Hi, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo, Director of Community Engagement at KMUW in Wichita. This special edition of Democracy on Tap is part of a series of conversations about relevant election matters that started during the 2016 presidential race. Tonight is a night when you learn how much your vote really matters. Not only do we have a senatorial debate that we'll break down for you, which could potentially change Kansas as well as the nation, but after this, we'll also have the final presidential debate coming up at 8 o'clock. We just heard from candidates Roger Marshall and Barbara Bollier, and we're going to break down what was said and what it all implies. On our panel this evening is my colleague Tom Shine of KMUW, Michael Schwanke of KWCH Channel 12, Claudia Amaro of AB&C Bilingual Services, and Mark McCormick, formerly of the Wichita Eagle and currently with the ACLU of Kansas. You can join in by sending us your questions either on Facebook or you can email us at info@kmuw.org. Let's get started. I want to ask each of you for your overall impressions from the candidates. We'll begin with you, Michael, since you were our host this evening.
Well, thank you, and thank you for hosting me here. Thanks to all the listeners and viewers out there. You know, one of my main takeaways right now, it did not seem that State Senator Bollier may have been on her top game tonight. I think, you know, it's important to point out for listeners that they just haven't done a lot of these type of events. It's been very limited. We just have not seen them debate, or in this case, you know, we call it a forum. But it does stand out to me there. You could see, you know, Congressman Marshall probably a little more used to, for example, being in the TV studio and being in front of cameras like this, and well prepared for the debate tonight. That was one of my takeaways. She did seem to warm up as the evening went through, and we got to some of the points. I think we were able to drill down. Once again, we're limited. You know, we have 30 minutes is all, and we just have to rapid fire these questions. And I always wish we could get a little more time, but that's just not something typically the candidates will agree to. So we have 30 minutes and we get to as much as we can.
Tom, your first impressions?
I agree with Mike. State Senator Boulier was a little, I know rattle's not the right word, but just a little maybe nervous. It's funny. I've done a few of these now with Michael and the folks and Melissa Bruner from WIBW, and it's a different thing. If you're in the studio, they're looking just into a bunch of cameras. There's no interaction, no crowd. They really can't even see Michael, myself, or Melissa asking questions. So it's a weird kind of a thing, and it can be a little intimidating because you're just staring into these cameras. I thought she, like Michael said, I thought she kind of improved. I thought Roger was a little more aggressive than she was, and a little more on the tack, which is, I think, probably been typical of the campaign so far. You know, his efforts to really, point her as an extremist, her efforts to point herself as a moderate is an ongoing theme we'll probably talk about more. But it was, I think it's worthwhile. I think this is only the second in-person debate, or when they've been with each other, that they've done. So I think it was good to have, and you can take away from it, if you're watching at home or listening at home, what you want.
Mark?
You know, it's interesting hearing what Tom and Michael are saying. It reminds me of that historic debate between Nixon and Kennedy, where the people who were listening to it on the radio thought one person won, and the person who watched it on television thought someone else won. I was listening to it. I wasn't looking at the candidates. And I felt like Bollier was a lot stronger than Michael and Tom did. It was an interesting tack that she was taking, almost like a boxer who wanted to stay very close to the puncher so that the puncher couldn't unload. I mean, she was almost kind of smothering him by answering almost identical as he was answering. And then periodically she'd kind of step out and jab him with an answer where she was taking a different stance. But it was interesting for those of you who were watching the debate as opposed to those of us who were listening.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Claudia, what do you think?
Yes, hello, good evening. Thank you for the invitation. I was really expecting more, I don't know, I was expecting something different, like them talking more about Kansas. I kind of felt like I was listening to the presidential debate. You know, they were talking on general issues that we know that parties have been fighting for a long time. And I wish it could be a little bit more local, a little bit more. I also feel like Tom that it was like an attacking, defending debate. Like one was attacking, the other one was just defending the information or what she called the misinformation. So it was pretty interesting. But I agree also with Mark. I've been also reading some comments, and I think there's a lot of people with different opinions about who won the debate.
So what challenges does Barbara Bollier face, especially considering we have not had a Democratic senator since the Great Depression? Let's start with you, Tom.
History is against her. There's no doubt about that. She has a long history stacked against her. The last senator you mentioned, George McGill, an answer to a great trivia question, I'm sure, was appointed to the office, won in 1930, then won again in 32 during the FDR landslide in 32 in the middle of the Great Depression, as you pointed out. We haven't elected anyone from the Democratic Party since. So that's been a long time. I think it's the longest streak in the country, actually, for either party in any particular state. We've had almost as many populist senators in our state history, the Democrats. So that gives you an idea. So I think it's going to be a tough battle. Really, none of the Democrats have really competed that well since really the 1970s, and when there were some fairly tight races. And there's not been a single-digit Senate race in a long time. So I think that's her biggest obstacle is, can a Democrat win the state? And I don't know that people think that she can.
Mark, do you want to weigh in there?
Oh, sure. It's interesting. So you kind of have to test the wind in the state. So if the state is looking for someone who is going to go to Washington and try and break gridlock, if you're looking for someone who is open to some bipartisanship, she did well tonight. But if the voting public in this state wants someone who is really going to hold the line on what they believe in as conservatives, I agree with Tom. She's going to have a tall mountain to climb. So it kind of depends on what the voters of the state want. But I think she's taking. It was clear that her tactic was to present herself as someone who is going to go and try and build coalitions and work across the aisle, work across factions, and hopefully people who are tired of the gridlock in Washington would gravitate her way. If that's a miscalculation, then obviously she's going to lose.
The one thing I'll touch on this, and she did, Mark. The one thing that history teaches us is that when the last Democrat was elected, there was a large FDR landslide. Will there be a Joe Biden landslide? I don't know, but if there was, and he, just really had a great election, could that be a scenario she could win? Yeah, I think that could be a scenario.
Any thoughts?
Sorry, I was just going to say I do agree with Mark. If you notice, she came right out of the gate tonight with saying that she has stood up to both parties in her career, and she wanted to paint herself as an independent. And I think she did do that throughout the forum tonight. And Claudia, I think you make a really good point. I want to go back on. It felt a lot like you're watching a presidential debate, and that has seemed to have happened over the past few election cycles. And I think those parties are, they give them, so much support and so many talking points. And, even at the end, you heard Congressman Marshall get in Nancy Pelosi's name, for example. and Chuck Schumer's name. And that's kind of a trend that we've seen. And I think, Tom, you've been part of these, that they are turning into national debates, and we really struggle to get them to drill down on Kansas issues. And I think if they would do that a little more, that may go a long way with voters.
And if I can add, I personally think that one of the challenges that she's facing is just being a woman. Like we haven't had a woman in that position in a while. And with everything going on, I mean, we have had actually very conservative people on that. And I'm not talking about parties, but I'm talking about it has been a male dominant position for a while. So I think that's a challenge that she's facing.
So how about Roger Marshall? What would his greatest challenges be coming up to election day? Tom, do you want to start us off again?
I think his greatest trouble will be President Trump. If President Trump really, takes a bath on election day, there's going to be a lot of Republicans, not just Roger Marshall, who will take a bath perhaps with him. I think that he has enough support that maybe that won't happen. But that would be, if I was him, that'd be the biggest thing I worry about, was something even more foreseen happening between now and election day with President Trump that would somehow trickle down the ballot to him. But like I said, he's from the big first district. The last two, both of our senators now were congressmen in the first big district, so it's got a history of producing senators. Bob Dole was from that district as well, so it's got a pretty good lineage there as well. But something national happened, and again, doing the research today, in 1930, when we last elected the last Democrat, 8 sitting Republicans lost their seats as part of the Great Depression, and the Senate turned over in 1930. Could that happen again? Yeah, maybe. But that would be, to me, that's his only concern.
I would say.
I think in those. Oh, sorry, Mark. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, in those polls, Tom, you look at the internal polling we've seen, and some of the polls dating back to August. For some reason, there is a block of voters who say they will vote for President Trump, but won't vote for Roger Marshall. And it's a small percentage, but I think Marshall has to find a way to get those voters. And I think we saw Bollier tonight making sure she stays with those independent voters. And I think Marshall's challenge in the last week or so here is to grab that small block of voters that are saying, hey, we're going to vote for President Trump, but we're not going to vote for Roger Marshall necessarily.
Yeah, I was going to go in that direction too, Michael, because I think his challenge is going to be distinguishing himself from Bollier, who I thought did a good job of staying very close to conservative talking points tonight, except in some key areas. She even said that she found things that she liked in President Trump's tax plan. His challenge is going to be distinguishing himself enough and making himself enough of a choice in this kind of toss-up between two people who I think are essentially Republicans. I mean, she did switch parties. The other challenge is something that
I'm sorry, Mark, what she'll have to do is what Laura Kelly did, is win the Democrats and pick up enough Republicans who are uncomfortable voting for a Republican candidate, was Chris Kobach in her race.
Exactly.
And then bring those over too. That's her formula. And then winning independents as well. I don't know that enough people are uncomfortable with Roger Marshall not to vote for him, Republicans.
But that's the challenge. I mean, you raised history before. What's interesting to me is which conservative ethos is going to win out here. Is it going to be the new conservative GOP of today that has moved to the right, or will we see a resurgence of the kind of Nancy Kassebaum Baker moderate Republican? I mean, we've always been a red state, but we've also been pretty moderate. So this will be kind of a litmus test to see where we end up, at least for the next 6 years.
And then again, I want to just share that the polls have been pretty close, and I know they have different numbers, but I think that's another challenge for Rogers. I think we see it on other races with other seats where you can clearly see who it's up front, and in this one, it has been pretty close.
And now the nation is responding to a second or third wave of COVID-19 looming this fall and winter. And each candidate told us what they would change and what thing they would keep. But I'd like to know if you think they went far enough. And we have a clip to listen to. Let's play that. Here's Barbara Bollier.
The first thing that I would change is they would work together to get something coordinated and actually follow a plan, like wearing masks, unlike my opponent who has run around the state without one on. We need safety and protection. The things that I would keep in place, of course, we need to have PPP, paycheck protection loans available to people. We need our Congress to come together to actually vote for another plan. But I am so pleased when they will work together to get help to the people.
And here's Congressman Marshall.
Our efforts have resulted in the saving of thousands of Kansans' jobs, as well as thousands of Kansans' lives. I want the people of Kansas to know that since the end of January, I was the first member of Congress to walk on the House floor and say, we've got a problem here. And since that day, I've been working day and night to make sure that we have vaccines and new therapeutics, that we have new testing as well. We now have new testing, the point of care testing in every nursing home in the entire state. Then beyond that, the economy, our paycheck protection program saved over 500,000 Kansas jobs, and the unemployment insurance gave us great benefit as well. But what we have to be careful of here is that the Democrats have promised they would shut down the economy if there's any uptick. And I think that's the question for Barbara. Would you shut down the economy? Would you keep our kids from going to school if we have an uptick in the virus?
Michael, they continued with mostly partisan comments on the federal response. Did you hear anything in there that indicated an open understanding of the situation, specifically in Kansas?
No, I got to be honest, I didn't really hear anything unexpected. And I think listeners and viewers want to hear a little more from candidates on this issue. Obviously, Marshall's talking point was on this was, I think he said it at least three, maybe four times throughout the forum. And that was, we cannot shut down this economy again. We cannot shut down the economy again. Mark pointed it out at the beginning that Boulier did have some, he called them punches, and I have it on my notes here, where that was a little, I called it a jab, where she was able to hit Marshall on, for example, the mask wearing. I don't know, in that statement, Marshall made several statements that I just don't know if they're true or not yet. I would, we'd have to look into them. I don't know if he was the first person in Congress to highlight that there was an issue. Someone else may, but no, they're walking, party lines. And I think Marshall was the economy. At one point, he said, the shutdowns have killed more than the virus itself. I think it continues on that bite a little bit.
And at the same time, he didn't even address the stimulus check, that they haven't even come up with a decision there.
How much do you think the pandemic has influenced the candidates' positions on the Affordable Care Act, or ACA? Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting to me that these extreme issues that, Vice President Biden ran away from during the Democratic primary, people have increasingly been turning toward these ideas to keep our economy afloat. Andrew Yang was talking about a universal basic income, and that's basically what we did. We sent everybody $1,000. And some of the people, some of the more progressive voices in the Democratic Party were also arguing that if we had universal health care, it would have been much easier to weather, COVID. It was interesting to hear both candidates tonight talking in favor of not only the past stimulus, but another one, which seemed to run counter to a lot of conservative ideas about spending, and particularly the scare tactics around the word socialism. It was interesting to me too to hear two doctors, debating this subject. But this was an area where I thought Boulier really shined. I thought her answers were better. They were more relevant. She spoke to the tragedy in Norton, that has gained national attention. I thought she spoke with some clarity and some insight, much more so on this case than did Marshall.
Mark, you bring up a really good point, and considering that their ad campaigns have focused on healthcare, and with them both being physicians, as we were reminded repeatedly tonight, do you think we got any clarity on other stands that they're taking regarding healthcare? Claudia, what do you think on that point?
Again, just like Mark said, I think on that one, Barbara was a little bit more clear on when she talked about pre-existing conditions. Unfortunately, I think she had to spend more time on defending herself or what she called misleading information than to actually get into the, some proposals or some new ideas for what they could do better. But again, I think she was the one that mentioned more about really supporting, bringing more support, better solution for affordable care. And then she also, one of the things that I really pay attention to was that she actually came up with numbers about how many Kansans, like that's one of the few things that I noticed that they're actually focusing on people in Kansas. They're coming up with numbers from Kansas. How many people support this? How many people support that? So I think they didn't have a big opportunity, like Michael said. I think they had, like, the time wasn't on their favor. But I think she was able to address the local issue better than Marshall.
Michael, what are
She
your
did bring up, she brought up Medicaid, which we've heard some of the Democratic candidates do when I interview them all, even though that's a state issue, they're able to bring them up in these federal races. But yeah, she did bring up Medicaid. You heard Marshall, not a lot of details on what he would do, but he did clarify on pre-existing conditions, saying that those would remain, that those with pre-existing conditions would still be insured. But again, not enough time and just not enough detail to really go in depth.
Racial and socioeconomic inequalities are becoming more apparent during this pandemic and economic crisis. What is the difference in approaches between Bollier and Marshall to address that gap and racial injustice? Mark, and since you served as the executive director of the Kansas African American Museum in Wichita for 5 years, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that first.
I thought that what Congressman Marshall was doing tonight was a calculation. He was playing to his base. He said, when asked the question about whether or not the society was fair, that he would consult with sheriffs and chiefs of police, as though the people who really bear the brunt of what is being described across the country as inordinate police stops and inordinate police protection. It made me want to hear from a candidate who could speak to the entire electorate as opposed to just the base.
If I can weigh in, as a brown woman, I didn't feel Marshall really answered that question. They were asking about justice, equity, and I don't think he did. I think he just make a stand. But Barbara said she acknowledged that there's not equitable justice for all. So I wasn't very happy with that part of the debate.
Well, and Claudia, immigration didn't even really come up in this debate. How much of a factor do you think that is in this race?
Well, he mentioned at the beginning when he was presenting himself, border security. And, he's been very strong on that. And that's a little bit, to me, is like, we're not even in a border state, And I understand that they have to have a stand. But at this point where we're talking about 125,000, according to the Pew Research, Latino voters just in Kansas. And he didn't, none of them really address anything around Latinos issues. And we're not only for immigration, I've been talking a lot with my audience about education and health as well. But I even believe in that justice piece. I think that's one of the reasons I wasn't even happy, because I don't think he was acknowledging, the diversity that we have in Kansas.
I mean, I wasn't happy with his answer either. The 99.9% number is, I don't know. I don't know it stands up to any scrutiny, to be frank. I don't know if 99% of anything is true. I mean, you could say that 99.9% of all journalists are a certain thing, but Tom and I and Michael could tell you that that's not true. I don't know how you could speak for that broad of a group of folk. It just seemed to me a calculation aimed at his base that I felt like maybe wanted to hear that. I was much more pleased with Bollier's answer, which was a simple acknowledgement that we do have a system that a society that had as an organizing principle race, and that legacy is still something that we live with. And she acknowledged it, which is, I think, the minimum of what you have to do when you're asked that question. Michael?
Oh, I was going to ask Mark. I may have missed it because I was juggling during that, the 99%. And Claudia, I wish we could have gotten to immigration, because especially in the southwest portion of our state, it's so important to ag and those plants down there. And I do wish we could have gotten a question in on that.
And the position that they're running for, that's one of the things that I talked with my audience, is very important for an immigration reform. And they have to consider, like, definitely Kansas, where a lot of people have moved, not necessarily from their countries of origin, but we have a lot of new immigrants coming from, like, California, Arizona, and other places. They're the ones building the roads. They're the ones beautifying some of the neighborhoods.
If you go to his webpage, he is on immigration, Congressman Marshall is a build the wall guy. It's on his page, which is probably not a big surprise. He's pretty much used the GOP line. The one thing, though, is that he has to do, as Michael pointed out, he has to listen to people, employers out there who need workers, whether it's through a visa program or a visiting worker program. So I think he's a little bit more nuanced than perhaps, let's say, Chris Kobach was on immigration. I guess who isn't more nuanced than on immigration than Kobach. But so he's a little bit more than that. I think Barbara is probably even more so nuanced on that. But yeah, 30 minutes, 28 minutes, we just didn't get to it.
I want to go back to the relationship of some Republicans with President Trump at the moment, as some Republican candidates have been distancing themselves from the president. How do you see Marshall's position affecting the race? Does Marshall, he doesn't seem to be doing so. Is that also your impression? Michael, what are your thoughts there?
I think in this, and Tom can chime in here, when we compare this to the primary, when everything was, I stand with Trump, I stand with Trump, I stand with Trump, we did not hear that tonight.
Did he even mention his name tonight?
I was going to ask you that. I'm not sure he actually mentioned President Trump.
I didn't hear it.
And just such a stark difference from the primary, when that primary, as you know, it was just a contest between all of them to see who could align the most with President Trump. That did not happen tonight. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that he has a block of, I think there are some undecided voters yet in this race. And those polls are showing that he needs to pull over a few of those. So I don't know. I don't know if distancing himself is the right word, but he just didn't include President Trump in his talk tonight.
Well, as you recall, Michael and Mark, you would too, and Claudia, when we had the governor's race with Chris Kobach, Trump made at least one appearance, if not two appearances in Kansas. His son made an appearance in Wichita. Various family members appeared as well. I think for Roger Marshall, and again, it's a little bit different because you can't make appearances as often, I think it's zero in terms of Trump tweeting out or anything that I'm aware of. So I think there is I think he's smart to just run his own race here and work on his own merits, and not have the baggage may be too strong a word, but have sort of that extra concern about what might happen with the president. So he, like Michael said, it was a distinctly different tone than we saw in August.
It's kind of interesting, and maybe Michael or Tom shed some light on this for those of us who are curious, but it's interesting that that the president might be struggling here in Kansas. I saw I was on a scan of stories today that the presidential race, the top ticket race, is tightening here in Kansas according to some polls. Do you have any insight as to how that is so in such a red state?
I think there was new polling out today from the New York Times and CNN, and including the race Michael referenced. I think the presidential ones is in single digits, but it's still like 6 or 7 points, which is for Kansas is not very much, but I'm still somewhat comfortable. I don't know. I think a lot of those Johnson County suburbs up in that area have they've sort of lost. He sort of lost them, or has, according to the pundits, has lost some of them. The machinists who are out of work, maybe voted for him, maybe aren't as inclined to vote for him now because they're out of work, whether it was his fault or not about the pandemic, but they're out of work. And again, going back to 1930, when people were out of work, they said, well, who was in office when I get out of work? Okay, well, I'm voting against him. So that might happen again. But I think he's still in front. We talk about not liking a Democratic senator. We've not gone Democratic for president since '64, and we went for LBJ, and then again back to FDR. So we're sort of in that same boat. So I still think he'll win Kansas, but maybe not by the margin he did. And again, that could cause a problem for Marshall if he's not dragging people along with him on the ticket.
And I think this race it's changing so drastically as Western Kansas communities shrink. Your Johnson counties grow. Years past, they could talk directly to, for example, the ag community. They're having to expand more. A challenge for Bollier in this is getting Western Kansas to even know who she is, other than what we see on their endless ads. And then the challenge for Roger Marshall is how do I talk to those people up in Northeast Kansas that don't know him? But the demographics, of course, are changing very rapidly in Kansas as rural areas are shrinking.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about tonight's U.S. Senate debate between Barbara Bollier and Roger Marshall, and this is a special edition of KMUW's Democracy on Tap. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo, and I'm joined by Tom Shine of KMUW, Michael Schwanke of KWCH Channel 12, Claudia Amaro of AB&C Bilingual Services, and Mark McCormick, journalist, best-selling author, and now of the ACLU of Kansas. We want you to join the conversation too. Please send us your questions on Facebook or email us at info@kmuw.org. Let's shift to overall policy stances. Do the candidates really differ on law enforcement? Marshall is quick to point out that his father was police chief of El Dorado for 25 years, and Bollier was clearly stated that she is not in favor of defunding police. When they were asked about whether the current system is equitable for everyone, here is what they said.
My opponent wants to take your arms, defund the police, and leave Kansans helpless. That is extreme by anybody's books, and we can't allow that to happen. We have to stand up for our police, and I just want the men and women in blue, I want every one of you to know that I will always have your back and always help support you to help keep Kansans safe.
And here is Bollier's response.
Yes, we have a system that is not always equitable, and we need to listen to our Black brothers and sisters, brown brothers and sisters who have said it is not done the same way towards them. We should have justice for all, and we can do that. We should start by getting a bill so that we can actually get money to our local government so they can fund our police. Let's work together to get that done.
Is there a lot of daylight between them on this? Tom?
Well, I think so. I think Mark hit it right on the head earlier that Congressman Marshall was talking directly to his base on that one. I mean, that was, policemen are great, the 99.9% of them, and she wants to take away your weapons, and what are we going to do? And she wants to defund police, which I don't think she does, and she said so. So I think that's it played into the thing you heard, and Michael, you heard this a lot tonight too, was he kept calling her extreme. And this is one of the, and I think he used the word extreme here too, using this as an example of her extremism, to saying she wants to do all these things, including defund police. I think she would say, no, I'm much more moderate than that. At least she acknowledges there's a problem. Can we fix the problem? And then and then also kind of backdoored in one of the talking points for Democrats is funding for city and state governments to help them fund city services, which would include police. The Republicans have been pretty adamant against that funding, which I think has held up the stimulus bill. But to me, this was an example of him painting her as an extremist, as he tried to do many times throughout there. I do think they differ, though. I'm not sure that he believes deep down. I may be wrong. That there's a problem, a major problem. Might be a small problem, but a major problem. I don't know that he believes that, and I think that many of his people in his base don't believe that either.
Did anything in this surprise you, Claudia?
He was a doctor, or he practiced medicine in Great Bend, and I talked to several Latinos in Great Bend, and their experiences with him as a doctor weren't very positive. So, talking about, like, I agree with Tom. I don't know if he's aware of the diversity that we have and that there's a problem. There's a problem with the justice system. And again, one of I noticed also that the word extreme all the time, and I'm wondering if that's just part of the decisions that they make to run the campaign, because most of his ads have used that word. Most of his ads have been attacking Barbara in that way. I get all of their political propaganda, and they had put religion a lot. One of the things that caught my attention from Marshall was like our God-given constitutional rights. And I'm like, everything is just so around religion also. And especially when they attack with that word extreme, that I really don't know. I don't know, I'm a little bit confused on that.
Michael, it looked like you wanted to jump in there.
Oh, I haven't, as far as extreme, I guess I've never heard Bollier say anything about defunding the police. Then you heard her say, I mean, I don't think she's ever said that. But I guess I haven't ever heard Bollier say anything that there's a big problem with policing. And maybe I've missed it. But even in my interviews with her, I don't hear that. I guess I don't hear a lot of detail from her on problems with policing, and I may have missed it.
I mean, there was a moment tonight, that moment that wasn't lost on me, that, I've said earlier that Boulier seems like a moderate Republican to me, more so than a Democrat. So on a stage for a United States Senate race, you had a candidate acknowledge inequalities in the criminal justice system. I think that was a big deal. I agree with Tom. That was a significant departure, I think, from anything we maybe have ever seen in this race. It also speaks to the distance that we've traveled in a relatively short time, to where there were people, much of the public, dare I say 60 to 70% of the public, outraged that Colin Kaepernick was kneeling during games, to this year, after the death of George Floyd, a wide acknowledgement from people on both sides of the aisle that we do have some issues that we need to address. And I think that was reflected in that exchange tonight. And I think it was significant. I can't remember a major party candidate with her kind of conservative bona fides making an acknowledgement like that.
Race has attracted some serious campaign spending by Democrats, as nationally the Democratic Party tries to flip Senate seats. Here in Kansas, Bollier is out raising and outspending Marshall. This is in a state that hasn't had a Democrat in the Senate since the 1930s. Can you all tell us how much this kind of media attention matters? Claudia, how much does it matter to the Latino community? What do you all think for different groups?
It matters. Like I told you in one of the questions, I think this has been a pretty close race. Unfortunately, a lot of the campaign or those types of campaign, they don't get to our Latino community. You know, a lot of Latinos are voting this year. They've been reaching out to me and asking me, but a lot of them really don't understand how the system works locally. They understand that there's going to be a presidential election year, and that's what they're going for because that's what they hear nationally. But there's like very little information directed to our Latino community in Kansas. There has been a big effort from the governor through the Kansas Hispanic and Latino American Affairs to really get the vote out and really get some education out. But unfortunately, I don't think the local candidates have weighed into the importance of the Latino vote in Kansas.
So who is being presumably captured by this effort? Tom?
That's a good question. I don't know. I know that I believe much of Bollier's money has come in from the coasts, which has, of course, then allowed the GOP narrative to continue that she's an extremist and that this extreme money from California and New York, is funding her, and she's not a Kansan, doesn't have Kansas values, whatever Kansas values might be to each individual person. I think it helps, through that narrative. I don't know how that there's a lot of undecided voters yet. There may be some. I would think that if you've seen their 50th Bollier ad or your 50th Marshall ad, that at that point you're not even listening really or tuning it in. I would think. But I know that they think it's important and they put it on. It's always laugh, Michael, when we're in the studio and we're on those 2 1-minute breaks. They always have campaign ads are on the break, and it's just sort of an awkward because they were both Bollier ripping Marshall or one her it's just awkward, like, oh God. So, but I think there's a lessening impact of those. There's sort of the lessening effect on those as they go on, and I think people get tired of them, and then I think they want to go vote and be done. And many people have already voted and they're done.
Can I speak to that extremism argument?
Yes.
It's something that's interesting, and I'm glad that Tom raised this issue earlier about the history. You could make the argument that Bollier is not the extremist. She is the person having expressed, as she did on that particular question, an acknowledgement of some racial realities, that she's really more in line with Kansas Republican values. There was a man who went to school in Junction City named Art Fletcher. Art Fletcher is an African-American man who worked for 5 Republican presidents. He is known as the father of affirmative action. He is a trailblazer in Black Republican politics. He was mentored by Alf Landon. There were many African-American business people, many of them in Wichita, who supported Richard Nixon, who people often credit with, the creation of the Southern Strategy. It would surprise a lot of people that Nixon enjoyed that kind of support. Stars like Sammy Davis Jr. supported President Nixon. That President Eisenhower, one of the reasons that I supported the name change at the airport was because President Eisenhower, a Republican, had an enviable record on civil rights. This is the person who sent troops into Little Rock to enforce the Brown decision, who desegregated Washington DC, who saw the Brown decision coming and selected a Chief Justice that he thought would support the Brown decision. So, I mean, if you, and Ike was very proud of his Kansas roots. You could argue that given her performance tonight, she's really more in line with the traditional Kansas Republican than Roger Marshall.
I want to get to a couple more questions before we have to wrap up this evening. So I'll move forward to this next one. The candidates tonight were asked about their presidential candidates' tax plans. At least Bollier didn't offer an obvious answer, saying that she favored Trump's recent doubling of the standard deduction. We have some audio for that.
But I didn't like that it added $1 trillion to our deficit. And so I think that we need to get together and have taxes that are fair to all, especially for our middle class, which is a history of what I've done in the Kansas legislature.
And Marshall was a bit more in line. Let's listen to his.
Our Tax Cut and Jobs Act gave us the greatest economy of my lifetime. The average Kansan family got to keep $2,000 more of their hard-earned money. Joe Biden, the Democrat Party, Chuck Schumer have promised to get rid of those tax cuts. And that's so extreme. And my opponent has chosen to leave the Republican Party to become a Democrat. She did that after they came out with their Medicare for All, their Green New Deal. And this is because they represent her values. They represent her extreme values. Of course, I'm going to keep the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act around. It was very successful.
Which one of you is just itching to respond to this?
I'll
Go ahead, Tom.
You used the word extreme twice there, not just once. But the other thing I think was interesting that I think was her strategy, and she used it there, was we need to get together. And she said that several times about getting together, working across with the other party, working across the aisle, trying to, like Mark said, which is later in his career, but that was a Bob Dole thing. Bob Dole worked across the aisle all the time, as did Nancy Lansing Cannonball, as did going back to Dwight Eisenhower. So I think that was her thing, trying to get into that tax plan. And as you said, Sarah Jane, she liked parts of the Trump tax plan. But to me, that was her strategy, sort of encapsulated: get together, moderate, work across the aisle, break the logjam that we have in Washington now. And his was extreme. And I'm still waiting for that $2,000, by the way. I don't know where that went, but I didn't see it. But I think that encapsulated what they both tried to do tonight in that one answer.
At the same time, I believe that although Marshall probably said what many people wanted it to hear, he was a little bit more consistent on his answer. I think that many of us who are kind of like sitting in the middle of different fights, different things that they're fighting, and I'm talking about the parties, I think that sometimes we don't need to have like a correct answer, an answer that we want to hear. If we want the parties to come together and work together, because like there's so many times that I feel like, man, can we get some middle ground? Because I totally agree with Mark. I mean, something similar has happened with immigration. Historically, more Republicans have supported immigration in the past. You know, so there's also like, there's a lot of Hispanics who are in the middle of it. They agree with some of the stuff that Republicans fight for, but they also agree with some of the stuff that Democrats ran for. So yeah, a lot of the times on debates, we really want to hear what we want to hear, but sometimes it's good not to have a concrete answer. That's my opinion.
I want to get each of your parting thoughts or biggest takeaways on our senatorial debate. What should voters keep in mind? And who wants to start us off with this one? Michael?
I don't have a lot, but I will say I think people are hungry for middle ground. I think there's a big chunk of voters who are hungry for bipartisanship and middle ground. I think the reality is we're probably not close to that. No matter what happens in this election, we could be a couple of cycles away from that, as we seem to be pulling apart more and more. But Bollier tried to hit that tonight, that block of voters, I think. And I think it's those voters who see her as more of an independent, she's been able to do something that very few Democrats have been able to do in history here in Kansas, and that is to not only reach those urban areas, but she has gone into those rural areas and has support out there. And how will this turn out? The polls are close. The most recent one does have Marshall up a little bit, but it is interesting because I think as we close in here, and I think we saw it from both candidates. Although Marshall tried to paint her as an extremist, we did not hear those extreme statements from Marshall that we heard, of course, during the primary. So I think both candidates, my main takeaway is both candidates probably trying to reach that middle ground.
Claudia, quickly, your biggest takeaways?
Well, definitely, like I said, I feel like, first I want to thank you guys for putting this debate together and putting this conversation together and inviting me, as I have a lot of followers who really need and are hungry of listening and understanding how this works. So one of my biggest takeaways is I hope, like Michael, that we can come up with a middle ground, that Marshall can start listening a little bit more as well, especially if he wins. Please start listening more to the realities of Kansas. And thank you.
Mark?
Yeah, I'm just really interested in seeing, which aspect of who we are as Kansans shows up on November 3rd. And frankly, we're not looking at an election day anymore. We're probably looking at election month. But I'm really interested in seeing, will it be the Kansas of our moderate past, or will it be a more contemporary Kansas that has moved further to the right? That's what I'm interested in seeing.
Tom?
If you're listening on the radio, if you could see Mark McCormick's bow tie, you would run out and buy a bow tie right now. Let me just say that to start with. Second, make sure you vote. And then third, it's a one-score game, late. Marshall has the ball, though. So I think it's going to stay tight, and maybe something crazy will happen at the end. But I think he's going to be tough to beat.
Thank you for your sport ball reference, Tom. Thanks again to the panel for joining us today. Special thanks to our media partners at KWCH Channel 12 for hosting the debate this evening. And to all of you, I hope you've enjoyed our program. It was sponsored by Susan and Leon Mader of Mader and Associates. If you didn't catch it all or know someone who missed it, just go to engageict.org to find the debate and our conversation. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. Don't forget to vote. And this has been a special edition of Democracy on Tap.